Hello, my name is Nuno, and as usual, this is the Reform Review, but this is a special one because I do want to talk about some breaking news. Some of you may have seen the post on the page already, but as you'll see down here, is that the Republican representatives have introduced a counterproposal for their version of comprehensive immigration reform, and they call it the Dignity Proposal. Sorry if the feed is a little bit laggy. There's some kind of internet issues. But I'm going to try and really have a conversation with those who are watching. So if you do have questions, as usual, please make sure to put them in the comments. I'll be able to see them and I'm monitoring them. So whatever questions I can answer, I will. And this can be questions either about this proposal or if you have questions about the state of the Dream and Promise Act or the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which is just going in the early steps in the House of Representatives. I can also answer a few questions on that. Maybe not too many things that are too detailed, but I can try my best to answer whatever questions you have. So definitely leave your questions in the comments. Now, to start, before we really go into looking at the proposal, and the one benefit is that this isn't going to be too long. The Republican proposal is only 1 page long. It doesn't have much detail on certain parts, so it does lag behind quite a bit. And I'll go into my analysis of why this is happening now. I wonder whether or not this is in good faith. If you can give me 1 second, I'll see if I can fix this network issue. Okay, I'm not 100% sure if that helped, but hopefully it did. To get started, I want us to look quickly at this article, which is what I saw that kind of tipped me off to this. It's an article by The Hill where it really talks about the details of the announcement. There was a press conference where Republican representatives talked about their bill, the reasons of why they're proposing this. As you can expect, it is a sharp critique of President Biden's United States Citizenship Act of 2021 and also the current situation at the U.S. border. They are really hinging on using the crisis at the border with the unaccompanied minors and asylum seekers being processed as a basis for their argument to deny any other form of immigration reform until there are more restrictions and more enforcement at the border to, as they say, control the crisis down there. So this is really what we're looking at right now. I'm going to expand it a little bit for you to have an easier time reading along. As it says here, it was a group of 9 Republican lawmakers. This is led by Representative Maria E. Salazar, who's from Florida. It's mostly her proposal, but it has some backing from Republican representatives. Now, they are saying that, and this is my assumption of why this is happening now, my take on this, is that they claim that the proposal for reform, the bill currently in place by the Democrats, will never become law in the way it's written. So what this tells me is that not only does the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 lack the support among Democrats in the House of Representatives, but now it's confirmed that Republicans will not support this whatsoever going forward. So we are in a bit of a deadlock of what this means for the future of immigration reform, because as I said, Republican representatives are using the crisis at the southern border as their primary excuse as to why reform will not pass right now unless the Democrats provide them really whatever concession that they want, saying that that's the only way that we can effectively manage the border and the only way we can help immigrants going forward. So, I mean, this is also something that really doesn't sit well with me, is that, yeah, it's true, right? It is true that our community does not want false promises or false hopes, but at the same time, these representatives are claiming that this is the only way that we can get reform if we make sure that we're punishing asylum seekers and immigrants going forward. So it is a little bit of a complicated situation. We're going to see how this develops, and I'm going to start going into those details, but I did want to just close this article off by highlighting here. This is what I'm talking about, their reasoning as to why why Republicans have to present their own reform rather than just helping to push forward the Democratic proposal. And they claim that Biden has lost control of the U.S.-Mexican border, and until he regains control by implementing policies that, as they claim, work, it's going to be very hard to do the Dreamers or anybody else in the sense of trying to help them. So what this tells me is that the current Dream and Promise Act, which is being considered in the House, is starting to go through committee, and also the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, I believe that if Democrats aren't willing to fold and provide Republicans what they're asking for in this kind of a proposal, that Republicans will stonewall and block any kind of immigration reform and claim it's because of the southern border crisis, and also that they've put forward the proposal, and as the Democrats who are at fault for not wanting to find some kind of bipartisan leeway. So it is really a terrible situation to be in for the immigrant community, because it is really playing politics with their lives, going back and forth, a ping pong kind of a game, where Republicans will continue to push this off. And as you'll see in the proposal, there is some indication that that's what might happen. So to get to the proposal, if you're on this article or if you saw the more comprehensive post we made, where it has all the details from the proposal already listed for you in a very simple, straightforward way. If you go to this article, it is right here. You can click on this link, and it'll open up to show you this proposal, but I already have it open here for us, just to take a look at, and I'll zoom in to make this a lot easier to read. And we're really going to go piece by piece on this, and I'm going to give you my take on what this means, and especially how it compares to the reform that was proposed by President Biden, because they are taking a very, very different approach going forward, where both proposals do provide some form of pathways to citizenship. The Biden proposal is definitely much more generous in the sense that it guarantees pathways to citizenship, and outlines clearly how long it will take for you to become a citizen, whether you're a dreamer, a DACA recipient, just any undocumented immigrant, or if you're an agricultural worker. So all those communities have a very clear and defined pathway to citizenship under the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, which is, again, President Biden's proposal. Compare that to this proposal, the Dignity proposal, from the Republican representatives, and you'll see a completely different focus where, as you can see, the first section here, and I'll just make sure I'm putting these up to help us, to guide us through this explanation. Section 1 of this proposal focuses on border security, enforcement, and asylum reform. So what this means is that Republicans are really focused on the southern border. Again, this is the crux of their argument, that they must secure the southern border before anything else can be done to help immigrants. And so what it asks for, in this first line especially, is to authorize full funding for border construction. So really what we're looking at here, and the second line really makes it clear, is that they're looking to create the border wall, which then President Trump was really a hard advocate for. This is to guarantee that there will be full funding for a complete southern border wall on the U.S.-Mexican border, using also technology, and really all of the ports of entry will be blocked. But the more important piece to take away from this first section is this third line, which is the more concerning piece to me, because the other thing you have to know about this proposal is, one, that it is a proposal, right? It is not a piece of legislation that has been formally introduced, and we don't have the actual text to go through and see really the qualifications, who's disbarred, and really these kind of nuanced details of what this line really means. Is that there is going to be a mechanism to ensure border security is completed before other reforms take place. So there is no other details on whether or not this means that future reforms would be blocked unless border security is ensured, or if it means that unless this section 1 of the proposal is complete, and by some unknown metric that representatives deem, that Congress deems that, okay, now the border is secure, then we can provide these pathways to citizenship. So that's still unclear, and I'll keep reading and keeping up with the news to see what the intention is. But for the time being, it's very unclear, and we need to be careful with the language that is put into the final written up bill, because that will determine how long, how much extra time will be necessary before these kind of pathways to citizenship are available, and whether or not there will be relief from deportation during that time, and if not, well, then how long will it take before people will actually get that kind of relief? So that's one thing to note on this. The rest of it is pretty straightforward on this section 1, is asylum reform. They claim that there's abuse of the system, and this is the very typical conservative talking point when addressing the southern border, that not everyone who comes should qualify for asylum, and that they're trying to abuse the system and take advantage of the generosity of this country. So take it however you will. This is always their claim. This is always going to show up, and this is what they're putting into the proposal, that they will reform it in some way that will really make it more difficult for asylum seekers to come to this country and receive asylum and some kind of help. I imagine they're going to aim to do similar policies which former President Trump had in place. I'm not sure whether they're going to reintroduce the Remain in Mexico policy to keep asylum seekers over the border and then have them be processed there. That's still up for debate. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the internal talks, but as it comes up, I'll make sure to always provide an update on that end. And lastly, the very usual piece that they will always have is enhanced enforcement to remove criminals. Again, from experience in organizing and in general watching the development of ICE over the years, their definition of criminal tends to change. So it is important to see in the written up form, when it's a more formalized legislative bill, who qualifies to be classified as criminal. Is it going to be left up to discretion of an officer to then determine it? Or is it going to have some kind of a standard in place that then will need congressional change in the future? Or is it going to be completely left up to the Department of Homeland Security for any new leadership to continuously change as they take new leadership down the road? So those questions are still up in the air. Again, this is only a one-page proposal, which unfortunately doesn't give us much. And at the end of this, I'm going to really explain my ideas of why this is happening and why it's just a one-page, just quick to get it out. But that's really section 1 of this proposal. Now we're going to go on to what I would call section 2, because although it's only a few sentences here, I imagine in a finalized bill, it'll be more fleshed out and be of lengthy size. So what this is about protection for dreamers. So they say that it will provide immediate legal status for Dreamers, authorized by Congress. Now, you'll see here, they don't have any qualifications listed, so who's eligible is still up for debate. I imagine they're going to go with the usual under 18 when you arrived, and then have some kind of a cutoff point that you needed to be in the country by some date, and then continuously present in the country from there forth. So it's still to be determined who will qualify for this kind of legal protection for Dreamers. But based on the language, it does seem that you will get immediate legal status. Whether or not that's going to be permanent resident status, meaning a green card, that is still unknown. Again, it's just a one page, not really detailed. Or does this mean that you're just going to get some kind of a conditional basis? I'm not sure yet. It does seem that for certain portions of this bill, it is copying from the DREAM Act, from the American Dream and Promise Act, and even from the US Citizenship Act for some parts. Like, for example, this piece right here, which is how do you qualify for permanent legalization? Well, you can qualify through work, military service, or even higher ed. That's the usual eligibility requirements when you look at all these other bills. So we'll see what this turns into when it's all fleshed out. And again, I'll always provide a summary of it. But on to the next piece, because this is the interesting one and something I did not expect to be included, especially by Republican representatives. But they call it a practical solution for the undocumented. Again, their biggest critique is that they don't believe that the generous approach of President Biden is appropriate for addressing the undocumented community. And so this is what they say is a practical one for them to negotiate on. And just excuse me, I'm going to drink a little bit of water here. So the proposal, again, is called the Dignity Proposal. And it's really because it creates the Dignity Program. So you're going to see this is really the big difference between the Biden proposal and now the Republican proposal. If you remember when we talked about the US Citizenship Act, if you're watching this post, you'll see recommendations on the screen to check that one out where we went into detail of that law. This is very different. Under the US Citizenship Act, you have a renewable temporary status, which provides you protection, work authorization, and many benefits to be able to really live your life in this country as a conditional or as a prospective immigrant in this country. Similarly, but very different, the Republican proposal provides a dignity status, right? So we're going to call it that. So a dignity status under the Dignity Program, which lasts for 10 years. And they make it very clear what this status does. But first, to qualify for this status, for the dignity status, you would need to, as they say, number one is to comply with all federal and state laws. So really not have a criminal background, which is why you would also be passing, as number two, a criminal background check. The third thing is that you need to pay back any taxes that you owe. So that's one thing. You need to start paying income taxes. So I assume when they say start paying, that by receiving the dignity status, you would receive some form of work authorization. And so then you would begin to pay income taxes and you would have to remain employed. Now, again, this is just a proposal. So there isn't the specific details about it written up yet. My hope is that the requirements for this line in particular for remaining employed aren't too strict where I say maybe, it really depends on what they expect of you. So they could be a bit lenient and give you some months in case, again, because, for example, if another incident or another health crisis happens similar to COVID and you find yourself unemployed for a long duration of time, either that's going to be included, some kind of an exception, or they could also be very harsh and strict and say, well, if you're unemployed for more than a month, you are no longer in good standing with your dignity status and you can now be deported. So again, we'll see how this develops when it's all written up. but I'm not too optimistic, knowing the conservative approach is to take a more harsh and strict stance against the community. So I expect that this one qualification to stay in good standing under the dignity status may be more strict and less forgiving, regardless of any kind of global situation or nationwide crisis. So do keep that in mind when we're going forward, that details are going to become clear over time, especially if Republican representatives decide to continue to stonewall and block any other legislation prioritizing their own. But continuing on, this is another interesting one that, aside from paying a fine, I think that's the industry standard really when you see any bill on reform. It says that you also have to make an initial contribution to the American Small Business Fund. So this fund is to help small businesses, especially during COVID, to support them and make sure that they can stay open and supply jobs to really residents in this country. So it is an interesting requirement. They have not, again, they haven't specified how big of a contribution this will be. And unfortunately, I worry that this will become sort of the wealth test to make sure that you have disposable income to make a contribution on top of paying fines and any other legal fees to go through the process of applying for the Dignity Program. So do keep that in mind. It may be really hectic of a process if this were to pass compared to a more lenient and generous system. Now, it does specify that the dignity status will not provide you permanent legal status. So this is just a temporary conditional status, right? It does not provide you any access to federal programs, so any benefits, entitlements. It does not say, so far on this proposal, that you'll be barred from state benefits. So that may be up for debate. And it may be a state-by-state case. So more conservative states will probably block anyone with this status from receiving benefits. I don't imagine that the Republican representatives, when they draft the formal legislation, will be providing clear instruction to states to make sure to allow dignity status recipients access to state benefits. It just doesn't sound to me, in my perception, that it will happen. So it will be left up state to state, or they might write it in that states cannot offer it either, especially if Democrats begin to cave into Republican demands and just give them really whatever they want. It'll continue to get more conservative and restrictive in its approach. That's what I'm expecting really coming out of this. Now, as I mentioned, right, the Dignity Program is 10 years in duration. And when you complete it, so say that you do remain employed the entire 10 years, you've been paying your income taxes, you paid back all of your taxes, and you've not committed any crime in 10 years, you can now apply for, as it says here, after 10 years, you will get an indefinitely renewable 5-year visa to maintain the work permit and legal status. So the dignity status is just, again, it's a temporary conditional status. So you won't be getting deported, and you'll be able to work in this country, but you receive no benefits. What this reads like is that, yes, when you complete the dignity program, you now get a 5-year visa, which again provides you your work permit and provides you some form of legal status in the country. Now, that's not permanent legal status, so you are not receiving a green card from this, but it does provide you more stable protection without having to worry too much about some of the other requirements that are for those still in dignity status. Now, there's also Section 4, right, which is about the redemption program, as what they call it. And the important thing to note is this plus 5 years. Because compared to the Biden proposal, or rather the Biden bill, it was formally introduced and is being considered, in the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, the pathway to citizenship is pretty clear. It's 8 years for really any undocumented immigrant, and only 3 years for DACA recipients and TPS holders and agricultural workers. Under the Republican version, aside for Dreamers who will be automatically given their legal status, undocumented immigrants have to go through the Dignity Program, so that's already 10 years, so far longer than under the Biden proposal. And then on top of that, they have to go through the Redemption Program, which is a minimum of 5 years and can go on for however long it takes for your petition for permanent status to go through the immigration system. Because as it says here, it is an optional program, right? And where you need to complete the 10-year Dignity Program first before applying to earn your permanent resident status, the green card. And it has a couple of requirements. First, you need to learn English and US Civics, so there will be some kind of test that you have to complete. You also need to contribute to your local community, either through volunteer work or through more contributions to the American Small Business Fund. So if you remember, that was mentioned over here to qualify for the Dignity Program. It's going to have the same kind of a requirement where you can choose to donate even more to the business fund to be qualifying for the redemption program. So this redemption status is the pathway, their version of a pathway to citizenship. But it isn't the same as the US Citizenship Act. And I need to be very clear on that, is that this is just an opportunity to be considered for permanent resident status, right? So for a green card. As it says here, individuals applying would go to the back of the line. So what this means is you have 10 years that you had to complete to start the process under dignity status. Then you have another 5 years minimum under the redemption program. And then you have any number of years that it takes for you to get processed to then get your permanent resident status. So roughly, it would be minimum of 15 years to who knows how long before you can get a green card under this proposal. It could be at the 15-year mark. It could be 20 years, 25 years. However long that backlog on the immigration system is will determine how long it would take for you to go from being an undocumented immigrant in the country to all the way to becoming a permanent resident in the U.S. So I guess the question of this is it a pathway to citizenship? Yes. Is it a generous and reasonable one? That's up for debate. Because is it better than nothing? Yes, right? Under the current system, there is no avenue for undocumented immigrants to become U.S. citizens. Under this one, there would be a pathway, but it could take decades for you to eventually become a U.S. citizen. So we have to be careful with this, and you'll see a little bit more as to why this may not be the best proposal, because it does seek to punish future undocumented immigrants and really the immigrant community in general. But before we get into that, there is one last section under this that's worth noting, and this is about guest worker reform. If you remember, under the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, President Biden offers a pathway to citizenship for agricultural workers. So those who've been working in the country for many years or will continue to work for many years, they receive a green card, and then they can work their way after 3 years to getting citizenship. So it does reform the H-2A system, but it takes a different approach. For the time being, it doesn't read as if it will be providing a pathway to citizenship for agricultural workers. It seems that it's just going to create a visa program for them, so that way they can continue to work here legally. Again, I may be wrong. They have not provided more details for now. It is very vague. It is just this one sentence of what they plan on doing for the H-2A visa system. So we'll have to see what happens there. But unlike the Biden proposal, this also looks at H-2B. Again, there's no details whatsoever. So I'm not sure what that would also mean. But more importantly, this is what I'm talking about when it comes to why this proposal is so different from the US Citizenship Act of 2021, is that it implements mandatory e-verify. I covered the e-verify slightly in one of the last reviews, but just in case you don't know about this, e-verify, which is just electronic verification, is the process for the federal government to ensure that US employers are only employing those with legal status in this country with work authorization. So for years, for decades now, Republican representatives and conservative members in Congress have been trying to institute a nationwide e-verify program to completely block out undocumented immigrants from working in the country. Because this would require, again, employers to make sure that you have work authorization in this country before you're allowed to have a job here and actually work. And it comes with many punishments for employers and especially for employees who do not have work authorization. So if this proposal were to pass, so once they write it up, it goes in and is considered, passes some committees, and is signed by Biden, if it gets signed by Biden, it would really give Republican representatives what they've wanted for so many years and punish all generations of future undocumented immigrants. Because once this is implemented, it will not be removed. I fully believe that. And it will just make it impossible for undocumented immigrants, really members of our community, to work in this country without fear of being detained and then deported. It makes it extremely difficult. It will require them to have to go get fake IDs, fake socials, just to be able to get any job in this country, unless an employer is doing it under the table, trying their best to employ them. So do keep that in mind. As I mentioned earlier, right, this is really the downfall of this. It's called having a clean bill. A clean bill is where you're really just getting the reforms that are necessary for the community without punishing the rest of the community who is not included and future members of the community. And what this bill is seeking to do is really, really punish immigrants trying to come here in a legal way. So, for example, asylum seekers at the border is going to reform the way that we process them. Again, the details aren't clear, but you can expect from the way that they're talking about the border crisis and in general, the support for Trump-era policies, that we may see these coming back in the future write-up of this bill. And it will seek to really punish and restrict immigrant communities and asylum seekers while also instituting this e-verify system, which will then punish any undocumented immigrants going forward. So this is another one of those trade-off situations where they say, hey, we will help you, we care about the community, we're the party of the people, and so we're going to give you what you want. But in the other hand, they have the club, which they're going to smack the community over the head with and make sure that really anyone coming after this reform is punished and restricted heavily. So please keep that in mind when this bill is talked about, when it's considered, when it most likely will go forward, because my interpretation is that this is being presented for a couple of reasons. One is the reason why it's one page and just kind of showed up out of nowhere is definitely because of the American Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2021 being considered right now and hopefully going for a vote in the next few days or in the next week or two to the House floor to then eventually be passed over to the Senate. Republican representatives, as we saw in that article, are really using the southern border crisis as an excuse to block all immigration reform. So they can claim that, hey, we love the Dreamers, we want to help them, but look, Biden, he's not doing anything. We're losing control of the southern border, and it's his fault. It's the Democrats' fault for not listening to us because we know what's best, and we need to take control of the border. And so it's the primary excuse to block everything, block all the legislation that would help us right now to at least get some relief going, while presenting this kind of a proposal where it will, again, give us what we need, but at the same time, damage and punish the immigrant community while also making it impossible for future undocumented immigrant populations to exist and survive in this country. So this is really the trade-off we have to think about of whether it's something we want. Because once it happens, and as I said, once the E-Verify system is in place nationwide and all employers are required by law to use it, then there's no going back and there's nothing we can do to replace it or remove it, because there's no way that any Republican Congress, whether they're a minority or majority, will remove it. If anything, they'll continue to build upon it and make it even more difficult for future generations of immigrants to work in this country, whether they have legal status. So I'm hopeful that it doesn't get to that point. I think it's at least beneficial that they included some kind of pathway for the general undocumented community. But again, it's really giving the bare minimum as sort of bait to pull us in, try and paint themselves as the party that actually cares. As they say, right, they label it here, practical solution for the undocumented. So where this goes in the future, I'm not 100% clear. I think it also provides the more, as they call themselves, moderate Democrats an excuse to not vote in support for the bills being proposed right now in consideration, because they'll say, for example, Senator Manchin, who has already publicly stated that he will not vote for any bill that has no Republican support, meaning that if Republican senators say they will not vote for the Dream and Promise Act if it gets to them in the Senate, then Manchin will say, hey, look, I already told you I'm not going to vote for this. And so he'll vote against it or just not vote. And you won't have enough votes to push forward that bill through the Senate as a clean bill. And instead, he'll say, look, the Republicans have proposed their own. I want to stand with the Republicans, even though he's a Democrat. That's his kind of shtick. That's the thing he wants to promote himself as. And then what happens is, most likely, we're going to have a bill that's similar to this dignity proposal, which again will seek to punish future generations of immigrants, regardless of their legal status. So I guess the main takeaway is, if you wanted the details of what's in the proposal, we kind of went over it. You'll be able to re-watch this if you didn't catch those details. It's very short. Again, it's a one-page proposal. I'm not sure how long it'll take them to write this up. If the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 is any indication of how long it'll take, I imagine it'll take them a month to really write everything up, put it into its sections, and then I'll be able to read it in full detail and give you another summary of those points. So for now, we'll have to wait. My hope is that Democrats don't use this as an excuse to put off this process any longer, although that is my suspicion, is that it will be put off claiming that they want to work with Republicans to be bipartisan. Again, it's not really the best thing they should be thinking about, but it is an excuse, a practical excuse for them to put off immigration reform for months longer. And then most likely in the end, even if the Republicans present this proposal, I highly doubt they will vote for their own proposal. We saw that during the COVID relief bill when they made their own amendments, passed their amendments, and then when it came time to vote yes for the bill, all Republicans voted no, even if they worked to get the bill amended to their vision to reduce it. And Democrats listened to them, followed along, argued that they had to make it bipartisan, and then they got no Republican votes. I imagine that this is going to be something similar. They're going to try and work with Republicans, make it more restrictive, reduce who gets access to relief, and then in the end, they're not going to even have enough votes to pass it, and then we're not going to have much of a reform. So that's my fear. Again, I tend to be a little bit more pessimistic, so I really do hope this doesn't come about. But this is more reason of why we need to organize ourselves as a community and fight for what we want, right? It's not about what they think we need. We have to be very vocal. We have to be very strong and organized to make it very clear and undeniable our needs. And our needs are to support all 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, as well as other immigrants who would benefit from a more humane and just immigration system. So that is what we're fighting for. And I do want to remind everyone, while I have you here, that I am planning a campaign to call every day in the month of April to call different representatives and to contact the White House to get a commitment from them to once again fight for their proposal, for their legislation of the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. Democrats are also at fault here for trying to take the easy way to break apart President Biden's immigration reform instead of fighting for it to get the votes that are necessary. So they're saying that they're going to review the USCA again in April. And so every day we will be calling. And eventually, if you're following Movimiento Cosecha, they will also have a march on May 1st. It'll be in Washington, D.C. In the descriptions post, I will make sure to share those details and another link to Cosecha's event. And I'll be trying to invite them on to give those details as well to you in a future show. But that's really all the details I need to share for today. Again, please, if you didn't catch the actual run through of the proposal, make sure to just rewatch this video afterwards and feel free to share this post with people who are interested in seeing how immigration reform is developing over time. And just another plug is that we do a live show more formally every Saturday and Sunday, beginning at 1:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time or 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. They're the same time, just different time zones. So please make sure to join us there. And again, as always, if you have questions, comments, anything that you want to let me know or would want me to research for you, leave it in the comments. I read them all and I typically respond right away. So that way I can also look that up for you and share that information right away. But for the time being, please share this. Let people know that this is something that's happening, and it's really up for debate what the future of immigration reform is, and it's on us as well to take action and make sure we pressure our representatives because, again, they're in these positions of power to help us, not to hurt us. That's always my belief, and it's time that we really pressure them so that they understand that as well. But for the time being, thank you very much, as always, for being here with me. I appreciate it, and I'll see you on Saturday, as usual, again, 1:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, if you want to watch it in English, or Sunday in Spanish. We also do that for you at same time, 1:30 p.m. Pacific Standard, 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard. So thank you as always, and I'll see you next time. So bye-bye.